Across the room sits John Malone, the most powerful man in American media. He's here because the US Senate believes he's built a monopoly. His TV cable company, TCI, controls what 1 in 4 American households watch on television. But Malone came in prepared. From the outside, he presented himself as an awkward, uncomfortable, almost nervous man barely holding his company together. By playing the underdog, he wins over pride and the Senate lets him off that day. Little did they know, even if he would have lost TCI, he would have still stayed in full control over American media. He already had a backup plan, one that would play a crucial role in the near future, one that affected every single American for generations to come. And if you think John stopped at media, you're wrong. Today, he is the largest landowner in America, owning 10 times more land than Bill Gates. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. To understand how he built his quiet empire, we need to rewind to 1973. By 1972, Telecommunications Inc. was collapsing in slow motion. The company had borrowed 15 times more money than its annual revenue. TCI wasn't just in debt, it was drowning in it. Vendors weren't getting paid, equipment was left unused, franchise agreements were hanging on by a thread. It was so bad, some cities were threatening to pull TCI's right to operate unless it delivered upgrades it couldn't afford. Inside, loyal executives whispered that the whole thing was a ticking time bomb. Outside, the banks sharpened their knives. Bob Madness, the founder who had built the company from scratch, had one final card to play. He picked up the phone and he called a 31-year-old executive he'd met a few years back. A math prodigy with a PhD in economics and a reputation for solving problems no one else wanted to touch. John Malone. Malone was quiet and analytical, not one for the spotlight. He studied engineering and economics at Yale, then earned a PhD in operations research. At the time, he was working as an analyst at Gerald Electronics, knees deep in financial modeling. He wasn't a cable guy, not yet, but he was smart enough to realize the opportunity. As a kid in Connecticut, John Malone was familiar with TV prototypes coming to life in his family's barn. His father, an engineer at General Electric, moved his lad home during a strike, and young John assisted in assembling TVs by handing vacuum tubes to the engineers, watching television prototypes take shape in real time. But still, the company seemed too far gone. Malone said no, twice. But Magnus wouldn't give up. On the third try, Malone finally agreed, under one condition. He'd run the company his way. And on April 1st, 1973, he took over as CEO of TCI. It was April Fool's Day, but this wasn't a joke. It was the beginning of something big. Malone took a 50% pay cut. He put his own money into the stock, and he walked into what was effectively a dead man's company. He later joked that his first 2 years were spent flying back and forth between bankers in New York and mayors across America. One day negotiating to delay foreclosure, the next begging to keep a city cable license alive. Malone wasn't just trying to buy time. He had a theory that if he could reframe the numbers, he could reframe the future. Most CEOs talked about profits. Malone was different and even invented the now widely accepted business metric, EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And it changed everything, because on paper, TCI was losing money, but in reality, it was still generating cash. Malone used EBITDA to prove it, to bankers, to investors, and to anyone willing to listen. It was a bold move, but it worked. EBITDA gave TCI credibility. It bought Malone time, and more importantly, it gave him a story. A new way to say, This company isn't dying. It's breathing just fine. Once TCI was no longer on the brink of collapse, Malone shifted from survival mode to expansion. He did this at a rapid pace. His view of the cable industry was simple: scale at all costs. If you want affordable cable for consumers, stronger negotiating power for business contracts, and the ability to influence the future of media as a whole, you need to be big, really big. So that's exactly what he set out to do. Throughout the late 1970s and well into the 1980s, Malone turned TCI into a machine that acquired smaller cable operators across the country. He wasn't throwing cash around. He didn't need to. Instead, he used TCI's stock to buy other operators, offering shares in exchange for assets, and often structuring the deals in ways that avoided taxes and minimized risk. This made it easy to grow without growing deeper into debt. It also meant that TCI could move quickly, absorbing companies that were still trying to figure out if cable even had a future. Malone already knew it did, and he was laying the foundation before most of the competitors understood what was happening. By the early 1980s, banks and investors started to notice. They saw that Malone's deals were working. The company was taking over markets and increasing its subscriber base, and doing it without the kind of financial blowups that had plagued other cable operators. Eventually, TCI got so efficient at this that banks were willing to finance nearly 100% of its acquisitions. Once again, Malone was 2 steps ahead of everyone. And in the 1980s, he introduced a new kind of deal. If a network wanted their channel to be distributed through TCI, Malone started to require a piece of the action. He wanted equity in the network. This strategy worked incredibly well and also multiplied his personal net worth. By the mid-1980s, TCI held equity in dozens of unknown networks at the time, including ESPN, CNN, and Discovery. And the more networks he invested in, the more leverage TCI had. Because if you were a new channel trying to reach a national audience, you needed TCI to carry you. And if you had already an established network, TCI could either support your growth or make life difficult, depending on whether you agreed to their terms. It was a powerful position. Everyone came crawling to him: politicians, pharmaceutical executives, and the likes. The power became harder to ignore, and people began to notice. By the end of the 1980s, TCI was the largest cable operator in the United States. It controlled access to roughly 25% of the market. And through equity deals, asset swaps, and strategic partnerships, Malone had built influence not just in cable, but in media more broadly. He hadn't broken any rules, but it was clear that one company and one man was now playing a role in shaping what millions of Americans watched every day. And that's when the scrutiny began. (1992). That year, the U.S. Senate called Malone to testify in a public hearing on cable industry practices. The mood was confrontational. Lawmakers were angry about rising cable prices and what they saw as increasingly aggressive behavior by big operators like TCI. Malone became the face of that frustration. He was accused of using TCI's size to bully content providers and shut out competition. One senator compared the cable industry to a mafia, calling it the Cable Cosa Nostra. Another likened Malone to Darth Vader. It was the first time most Americans had heard his name, but instead of meeting the moment with corporate confidence, Malone leaned the other way. He purposely appeared cautious, reserved, almost uncomfortable. He told the Senate that the cable business wasn't nearly as profitable as people thought, that price hikes were often necessary just to stay afloat, that TCI was doing its best to keep up with rising costs, and still invest in future infrastructure. To the average viewer, he looked like a business owner just trying to keep things together. And the senators were manipulated to feel the same way. They didn't grow him harder. But what they didn't realize, and what barely came up in the hearing, was that Malone had already taken steps to protect himself. A year earlier, he had quietly spun off TCI's most valuable programming assets into a separate company, Liberty Media. It was framed as a business decision, a way to separate the heavily regulated cable infrastructure from the more flexible media investments. But in reality, Liberty Media wasn't a holding company. It was the powerhouse at the heart of his next empire. Liberty wasn't a household name. It didn't have many employees, and most of its assets were minority stakes in other businesses. But that was the point. It allowed Malone to keep his influence while drawing less attention. And in 1999, when AT&T offered to acquire TCI for $48 billion, Malone was happy to sell. He agreed to the deal. He handed over the cable systems of the company he had spent more than 2 decades building. Little did they know, he kept Liberty Media, the most valuable part. Through Liberty, Malone started building a new kind of empire, one that didn't rely on operating companies directly, but instead on strategic ownership. He bought into DirecTV, one of the biggest satellite TV providers in the US. Then he secretly swapped the stake for a large share in Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, without Rupert knowing. Murdoch was forced to strike a deal and buy out Malone's shares just to maintain control of his own empire. Malone was a force to be reckoned with, and no one's company was off limits. Over the years, Malone's portfolio grew to include assets like the Atlanta Braves baseball team and Formula One racing, all calculated investments in companies that sat at the intersection of content, distribution, and the audience's attention. As Liberty Media grew, he created new divisions. Liberty Global, which expanded into Europe and became one of the largest broadband and telecom operators outside the United States, and Liberty Broadband, which would later take a major stake in Charter Communications, the second largest cable provider in the US behind Comcast. Today, well into his 80s, John Malone lives in Montana and remains the chairman of Liberty Media and Liberty Global, and his fingerprints are still on many big media deals. He's on the board of companies like Charter Communication, Warner Brothers, and Discovery. Unlike many billionaires, Malone has kept his personal car collection out of the spotlight. But knowing John Malone, and the fact that he owns part of Formula One, you can bet he has the rarest cars in the world. He also owns a 245-foot, $90 million super yacht called Sea Owl, and a second super yacht called Liberty. In true Malone fashion, business wasn't the only area he expanded to. Over the years, Malone began acquiring land, which started gradually, scaled like everything else in his life. Now, John Malone owns over 2.2 million acres of land in the United States. That makes him the largest private landowner in the country, far ahead of billionaires like Bill Gates or Ted Turner. To people who know him, it wasn't surprising. Land, like media infrastructure, is something that doesn't draw much attention. But it's something that's finite, and with that, gives you control. We've published new videos every Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern about the unknown entrepreneurs and the hidden companies that quietly shape our world. If you like these untold stories, please subscribe. Your support means more than you know and helps us continue delivering amazing content.